The first snowfall of December had already settled deep into the folds of the Appalachian highlands, layering the ridgelines in silent white. But beneath the surface beauty of the frosted pines and weathered rock outcroppings, there was an unease that had hung over this corner of the mountains for nearly 2 years. It began on a cold morning in January of 2021, when an experienced hunter named Daniel Rowe failed to return from the woods he knew better than anyone. At first, it was a simple missing persons report. By the end, it was the kind of story locals would only whisper, about one that ended beneath the gnarled branches of a solitary oak tree, miles from the nearest marked trail. In the town tucked just below the mountain's shadow, people knew Daniel as a man who could read the forest like a book. Tracks in the mud, the bent shape of grass, the faint scent of game in the air. These were all signs he could follow with uncanny precision. That morning, the sun was only a pale smear behind thick clouds when he loaded his gear into the back of his truck. It was just after 5:00 a.m., the temperature hovering below freezing. He told his wife he'd be back before dark. He didn't say exactly where he was going. In the Appalachians, hunters often kept their favored spots to themselves, the locations passed down like family heirlooms. She didn't think much of it, but as dusk bled into night and the headlights never returned, her unease hardened into something colder. By midnight, she had called the sheriff's office. The deputy on duty knew Daniel well. This wasn't the kind of hunter who got turned around in the woods or lost track of time. Within an hour, 2 cruisers rolled down the icy road toward the last place his wife believed he might have gone, a narrow turnoff along an unmarked logging road, its entrance nearly swallowed by underbrush. His truck was there, parked at an angle, the driver's side door locked, the frost on the hood unbroken. The only clear sign of movement was a single set of boot prints leading away from the vehicle into the trees. The initial search was swift but limited, hampered by the darkness and the snow already falling heavier by the hour. Volunteer rescuers and deputies pushed into the woods, calling his name into a silence so deep it seemed to absorb the sound. The prints from his boots were crisp at first, clear impressions in the snow, but after a quarter mile, they blurred and softened under the new accumulation. Beyond that, the ground was untouched. It was as though he had walked straight into the storm and been swallowed by it. At dawn, the search expanded. Experienced trackers arrived, men and women who had pulled lost hikers and hunters out of these mountains before. They fanned out, moving methodically through ravines, over ridgelines, and into the shadowed hollows where snow drifted deep against the trunks of ancient hemlocks. The forest gave them nothing. No broken branches, no scraps of clothing, no dropped equipment. Dogs were brought in, noses to the ground, weaving between the trees, as their handlers urged them forward. But the scent trail was weak, as though whatever had happened out here had happened quickly and left no time for a struggle. By the third day, the search radius had expanded to nearly 10 square miles. Helicopters swept low over the mountains, the thump of their rotors echoing through the valleys. From the air, search crews could see the veins of frozen creeks, the meandering scars of old logging roads, and the occasional cabin roof, half buried in snow. But there was no sign of movement. Ground teams moved slower now, their eyes scanning for anything. A scrap of orange hunter's vest, a shell casing, a flash of reflective metal that might anchor them to Daniel's path. When the first week ended without a trace, the operation shifted. It was no longer a rescue mission. It was a recovery. Deputies and family members admitted quietly what no one wanted to say aloud. The cold, the snow, and the remoteness meant survival beyond a few days was unlikely. Still, the search continued, driven by the need for answers. 2 weeks later, the last official sweep ended. The woods were left to the winter. His wife refused to move his hunting gear from the corner of their garage. His truck remained in impound, the snow chain still on its tires, as though waiting for him to return and claim it. But the mountain had a way of keeping its secrets. Months passed. Spring rains turned the snowmelt into swollen creeks. Summer leaves closed in the canopy, swallowing the trails in green shadow. Daniel's name became another quiet story in a town where people already had more than enough of them. The following autumn, a small team of local volunteers decided to search again. These weren't deputies or search and rescue professionals. They were neighbors, fellow hunters, and friends who knew the mountain's lesser-used trails and unmarked hollows. They moved deep into the backcountry, covering terrain far from where the original search had focused. On the third day, one of them, an older man who had hunted the ridges for decades, paused on the slope above a creek to scan the valley below. Something caught his eye, a pale, angular shape in the leaf litter. It was no animal bone. It was the fractured edge of a human skull. The scene that followed was handled with quiet precision. The volunteers called the sheriff's office. Deputies arrived on foot, weaving through the steep, rocky terrain until they reached the site. The skull was half buried beneath a layer of damp leaves at the base of a massive oak tree. Its trunk twisted upward, gnarled and weathered, the roots protruding from the earth like the bones of some older, larger creature. Beneath those roots, partially concealed, were more bones. They had been there a long time, long enough for the earth to begin reclaiming them. The discovery site was far from any trail, nearly 5 miles from where Daniel's truck had been found. The distance alone raised more questions than it answered. The sheriff's deputies marked off the area with tape. Though out here, deep in the woods, it felt more symbolic than practical. The air was heavy with the damp scent of earth and moss, the low light of late afternoon filtering through a canopy that had long since shed its leaves. The oak under which the remains lay was enormous, its trunk wide enough that 3 men could barely encircle it with their arms. The ground at its base sloped gently toward the creek, the soil dark and loamy, littered with decades of decomposed leaves. It was a place easy to miss unless you were standing right in it. A forensic team was called in from the nearest city. They arrived the next morning, their boots sinking into the mud as they carried in the heavy plastic cases that held their tools. The work began slowly. Every inch of soil around the oak's roots was sifted by gloved hands. The bones were fragile, weathered by 2 years of freeze and thaw, but remarkably complete. They lay in a loose scattering, as if the elements had disturbed the original placement over time. Among them, the forensic anthropologist noted something strange. The position of the femurs and pelvis suggested the body hadn't simply collapsed there. It had been placed. Clothing remnants clung to the soil, a few scraps of fabric in muted camouflage, the kind common to hunters in these mountains. A partial zipper and fragments of nylon webbing suggested what had once been a backpack strap. Near the skull, a single brass rifle casing gleamed faintly under the dirt, its surface dulled but intact. The team photographed and bagged everything, each piece marked and logged before being carried out of the clearing. By the second day, they had recovered enough to send for dental records. The sheriff's office didn't wait for the lab results to start making calls. Everyone knew who these bones likely belonged to. When the confirmation came back, an exact match to Daniel Rowe, there was no surprise, only a deepening of the unanswered questions. If Daniel had died of exposure, why had his body been found miles from the area where his truck was discovered? The ridgelines and valleys between the 2 points were rugged, a maze of steep inclines, boulder fields, and dense undergrowth. It wasn't a path a man would take by accident, especially not in snow and with daylight fading. And then there was the oak itself, a solitary giant standing in a stretch of forest otherwise dominated by younger growth. For locals, it was a landmark. For investigators, it was now something else entirely. The last place Daniel had been. The medical examiner's office began their work with what little soft tissue remained, preserved in pockets of soil that had stayed cold and damp. There were no signs of animal predation severe enough to account for the scattering of bones, and no clear fractures that suggested a fall. Toxicology would be attempted, though after 2 years the likelihood of retrieving usable samples was slim. Still, every effort would be made. Back in town, the news spread quickly. In the diner, at the feed store, and at the single gas station along the main road, conversations were hushed but steady. The mystery of Daniel's disappearance had weighed on the community for years. Now that he'd been found, the relief was tempered by the way he had been found. There was no clear explanation for his location, no sign that he'd been trying to make his way back to safety. Instead, it felt as though he had gone somewhere with purpose and never left. The sheriff's investigators pulled the original case file, spreading its pages across a conference table. Maps were unrolled, with pins marking the truck, the last known boot prints, and now the oak tree. The direct line between them crossed terrain, with no established trails, cutting through sections of forest thick enough to block out the sun even at noon. Search teams had combed parts of it before, but never that exact pocket where the oak stood. The original grid had simply missed it. They re-interviewed everyone who had spoken to Daniel in the days before he vanished. His wife repeated the same story. He had seemed calm that morning, routine, and focused on the hunt ahead. There had been no argument, no financial trouble, nothing in his mood to suggest he might walk willingly into danger. Friends described him as level-headed, cautious even, the kind of man who carried extra gear, just in case, and who never underestimated the mountains. The casing found near his remains was analyzed. It matched the caliber of the rifle registered to Daniel, the same rifle missing from the scene. The absence of that weapon was a critical gap. If it had been stolen, by whom? And if Daniel had fired it, what had he been aiming at, or who? Late in the week, the forensic team returned with a small but significant discovery. In the soil beneath where the skull had rested, they had found a patch of disturbed earth, distinct from the surrounding area. It appeared to be an old fire pit, shallow and long-coaled, with a scattering of charcoal and a half-buried tin can blackened by heat. Whoever had been here had made a fire. Whether it had been Daniel or someone else remained unknown. The sheriff's office kept these details quiet for the time being, avoiding public speculation. But behind closed doors, the theories began to split. One line of thought held that Daniel had become disoriented, wandered far from his intended route, and succumbed to the cold despite his skills. The other, quieter theory suggested something darker, that Daniel hadn't been alone in those woods, and that the oak tree had been chosen not by chance, but by someone else entirely. By the end of the month, winter had moved back in, with full force. Snow once again covering the ridge where the oak stood. The site was left marked and logged, its coordinates stored in the sheriff's file. In spring, when the ground softened again, they would return. There was more to find here. Everyone could feel it. Spring thaw brought with it a renewed urgency. The snowmelt fed the creeks until they ran high and fast, the sound of rushing water carrying through the trees. In that window between mud and new growth, the sheriff's team hiked back into the hollow where the oak stood. The forest had changed in subtle ways. Fresh deer tracks in the soft earth, moss reclaiming fallen branches, but the tree remained as they had left it, towering and still. This time, they brought metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar, determined to map every inch around the base. Within an hour, a low tone from one of the detectors signaled a hit. The reading came from a point less than 10 feet from where Daniel's skull had been found, buried beneath several inches of compacted soil and leaf litter. The excavation was careful, the dark earth falling away to reveal a rusted hunting knife with a cracked wooden handle. Its blade was stained with corrosion, but the shape was intact. The knife was bagged and labeled and sent back to the lab for testing. It wasn't the only find that day. Near the roots on the creek-facing side of the oak, a small depression in the soil revealed something unexpected. A tightly folded scrap of fabric, stiff with age and dampness. When unfolded, it proved to be the torn shoulder of a camouflage jacket, the pattern still faintly visible despite the discoloration. The tear was jagged, as though it had been ripped free under force. Investigators knew it could be significant, but they also knew the forest could keep items like this for years without meaning. In town, the discovery of these items reignited the conversations that had simmered for 2 years. Old stories about the hollow resurfaced, accounts of strange lights in the trees and of voices heard where no one should be. Most dismissed them as the product of isolation and imagination, but others leaned in, convinced that Daniel's death was tangled with something far older than a single man's disappearance. Back at the lab, the knife was cleaned and analyzed. There was no visible blood, but trace testing revealed microscopic residues consistent with deer tissue, an unremarkable finding for a hunter's blade. What caught the forensic analyst's attention was the faint presence of human epithelial cells on the handle, preserved enough to yield a partial DNA profile. It was a match for Daniel, as expected, but also showed traces of another individual, one not in any local or state database. That second profile shifted the investigation overnight. The sheriff's office began pulling in records of anyone who had been in the area during the days surrounding Daniel's disappearance. Hikers, seasonal workers, and even road survey crews were cross-referenced. They found a handful of names, but one in particular drew attention. A man who had been ticketed for illegal camping on public land, less than 5 miles from where Daniel's truck was found. He had given a local address, but no permanent residence, and his record showed a scattering of petty offenses in several counties. Detectives made the drive out to the address, listed an aging trailer set back on a dirt track, the yard cluttered with rusted tools and the shells of old appliances. The man answered the door slowly, his eyes darting to the unmarked cars, before settling on the badge one detective held up. He was cooperative, if guarded, and denied ever meeting Daniel Rowe. He claimed he had been camping to hunt small game and had left before the weather turned. When asked about the Oak Hollow, he said he had never heard of it. His alibi for the day Daniel vanished was thin, relying on his own statement and a vague reference to a friend down near the state line. The friend could not be located. Still, without physical evidence tying him to the scene, the sheriff's office could only note his name in the file and move on. Summer came, bringing with it long days of green light filtering through the canopy. Investigators returned again to the oak, this time with a different approach. They set up a wide perimeter and worked outward in a slow spiral, scanning the ground for any trace of items displaced over time. On the second day, one of the searchers called out, half buried in a tangle of roots, wedged in so tightly it had to be pried free, was the rusted frame of a rifle. The barrel was bent, the stock long since rotted away, but the caliber matched Daniel's missing firearm. The serial number was barely legible, the corrosion eating away at the stamping, but lab work confirmed it was his rifle. What remained unanswered was why it had been left there, hidden but not buried, in a spot so close to his final resting place. Ballistics testing was inconclusive. The barrel's wear and rust obscured any potential markings from a fired round. The find deepened the central mystery. If Daniel had been armed, why had he not used the rifle to signal for help, defend himself, or even simply carry it until the end? By early autumn, the Oak Hollow had yielded all it seemed willing to give. Investigators closed their active search, moving the case back to a slower background pace. Leads were followed, rumors checked, but nothing broke through the wall of time and distance that now stood between them and the truth. Yet for all the unanswered questions, one thing had become certain. Daniel Rowe had not simply lain down to die under that oak. Too many details, his position, the missing gear, the rifle's strange concealment, pointed to the presence of another. And until that other person was found, the oak's shadow would remain long over the case. Winter settled over the mountains in sharp, brittle layers. Ice rimmed the creek banks, and the trails became ribbons of packed snow and frozen mud. The Oak Hollow stood silent again, the great tree's branches stripped bare, its roots locked in the frost. For most, the case had gone dormant, another cold file among dozens. But inside the sheriff's office, one deputy kept circling back to the second DNA profile from the knife. It wasn't a match to anyone in the system, but it was a breadcrumb, one of the few they had. That deputy, working with the state crime lab, requested the sample be rerun through a newer genetic database designed for familial matching. The hope was, that even if the source wasn't in the system, a relative might be. Weeks passed with no word, until one gray January afternoon, the call came through. There was a hit, not a direct one, but a close enough relation to suggest a half-sibling or cousin. The match was tied to a man currently incarcerated 2 counties away on an unrelated weapons charge. 2 detectives made the drive out to the correctional facility, snow dusting the road as they went. The inmate, a wiry man in his early 30s, looked surprised to see them. He admitted that the person they were interested in was his cousin, a drifter named Paul Vance. According to him, Paul had lived in and out of the backcountry for years, working odd jobs and disappearing for long stretches. He was known to camp illegally, poach game, and stay far from anything resembling permanent ties. The detectives began building a file on Vance's last known addresses, vehicle information, prior arrests. A pattern emerged. In the months before Daniel disappeared, Vance had been spotted several times in the very stretch of forest surrounding the hollow. Witnesses recalled a man fitting his description with a small, battered tent and a habit of watching people from a distance before vanishing into the trees. A warrant for his arrest was issued on unrelated outstanding charges, giving the sheriff's office legal grounds to bring him in for questioning. It took nearly a month to find him. He was picked up just after dawn, walking along a frost-hardened logging road with a pack slung over his shoulder and a rifle strapped to the side. In the interview room, Vance sat slouched, his eyes flicking between the detectives and the table. He denied knowing Daniel Rowe at first, but when confronted with the DNA evidence from the knife, his expression shifted. His version of events was halting and uneven. He claimed he had stumbled on Daniel deep in the woods, disoriented and not looking well. According to Vance, Daniel had been alone, his gear scattered, his speech slow and slurred. Vance said he offered to help, leading Daniel toward what he claimed was the nearest road. At some point, he said, Daniel sat down beneath the oak and refused to move. He insisted the man was still breathing when he left him there. When pressed on why Daniel's rifle had been found hidden and bent out of shape, Vance shrugged, saying he didn't want kids finding it. The answer rang hollow. Investigators didn't believe the whole story, but without more evidence, they couldn't prove otherwise. They released Vance under strict conditions while they dug deeper. His campsite from that year was long gone, but old trail cameras from a nearby research project were pulled for review. Weeks of images were scanned until one frame, blurry but distinct, froze the room. Vance, walking alone through the undergrowth with what appeared to be Daniel's pack slung across his shoulders. The date stamp was 3 days after Daniel was last seen. Armed with that, investigators searched Vance's current campsite. Under a tarp and plastic storage bin, they found an assortment of gear, some modern, some weathered almost beyond recognition. Among the older items was a camouflage jacket sleeve, torn in a way that perfectly matched the fragment found near the oak. Tests confirmed both pieces were from the same garment. With that, the case shifted again. The jacket had been Daniel's, the knife had carried both their DNA, and the rifle's concealment made sense only if someone wanted it hidden. The picture forming was one of control, of stripping a man of his tools, isolating him, and leaving him in a position from which he couldn't recover. The sheriff's office moved to rearrest Vance, this time on charges directly connected to Daniel's death. He was taken in without resistance, the winter light fading over the hills as the patrol cars wound back toward town. Inside the interview room again, faced with the mounting evidence, Vance's story changed. He admitted taking the pack and jacket. He admitted handling the rifle. But he claimed Daniel was already too far gone when he found him possibly sick, possibly injured. Vance said he didn't want to get involved and simply took what he thought might be useful before leaving him there. It was a version of events that carried the stink of self-preservation, an attempt to skirt the line between theft and something darker. Still, there was a gap of 2 full days between when Daniel was last seen and when Vance appeared on that trail camera. Where had he been in that time? and what had really happened beneath the oak. The trial was set for late spring, the mountains just beginning to trade their frost for damp earth and early buds. In the weeks leading up to it, prosecutors pushed for a fuller account, pressing Vance with the reality that the evidence already tied him to Daniel's disappearance and final hours. Bit by bit, the guarded evasions gave way to something closer to the truth. He began with the weather, a cold snap that had settled in fast, catching Daniel unprepared. Vance claimed he had been running trap lines near the hollow when he heard movement through the underbrush. Daniel emerged, pale and unsteady, clutching his side as if in pain. His speech was slow and slurred, and his pack hung half open, spilling gear. Vance said he led him to the oak, suggesting they rest before finding the road. But under questioning, the details shifted. He admitted noticing the rifle almost immediately, recognizing its make and condition. He said he'd been eyeing a replacement for months. The opportunity, in his words, was just there. When asked why the knife carried both their DNA, he said he'd used it to cut straps from Daniel's pack, taking food, tools, and the jacket, stripping away most of what Daniel had to protect himself from the cold. At first, he insisted Daniel was still alive when he left, but the weight of silence in the room pressed further. Finally, he admitted returning to the oak the next morning. Daniel was still there, curled on his side, shivering and barely responsive. Vance said he stood over him for a long time, thinking. In the end, he didn't offer water or help. He didn't call for rescue, though he knew the nearest fire road was less than an hour's walk away. He turned and left, taking the rifle with him. By the time a hunter stumbled across the shallow rise beneath the oak 2 years later, the forest had long claimed what was left. Forensic work could confirm the cause was consistent with hypothermia, but the circumstances depriving him of gear, food, and protection made the case for homicide by neglect clear. When court convened, the prosecution laid out the sequence in exacting detail: the encounter, the theft, the abandonment, and the concealment of key belongings that might have drawn rescuers sooner. Photographs of the knife, the jacket fragment, and the bent rifle were shown in sequence. Witnesses testified to Vance's presence in the area, his history of taking from others' camps, and his preference for avoiding contact with law enforcement. Vance's defense leaned heavily on his claim that Daniel was already in fatal condition when they met. But the jury wasn't swayed. After deliberating for less than a day, they returned a guilty verdict on charges of second-degree murder and theft. The sentence was handed down quietly decades behind bars, with no possibility of parole before old age. Vance showed little reaction, his expression fixed as the gavel fell. Outside, the air smelled faintly of rain, the streets wet under a sky the color of slate. For Daniel's family, the verdict closed one part of the wound. His remains were released and buried in the small cemetery on the edge of town. The ceremony, attended by those who'd spent long days on the search teams, combing ridges and creek beds when hope was still alive. The Oak Hollow was never mentioned by name during the service, but for those who'd been there, the image lingered of a great tree standing over a patch of earth where time and truth had been buried together. The sheriff's office boxed up the case file, placing it alongside others that told their own stories of wilderness and the thin lines between chance and choice. In the quiet of the evidence room, the knife sat sealed in plastic, the jacket fragment folded beside it. Objects that had traveled miles through the backcountry, carried in one man's hand before becoming the silent witnesses that would undo him. Spring crept into the mountains, greening the slopes and sending meltwater rushing through the hollows. The oak leafed out again, its roots buried deep in the same ground that had held its secret for years. From a distance, it looked the same as it always had, immovable, ageless. Up close, the soil still bore the faintest trace of disturbance, softened now by rain and time. The hikers who pass through in years to come won't know the story. They'll see the oak and think of its size, its age, and maybe take a photograph before moving on. The forest doesn't tell what it keeps. But for those who searched, who stood in that cold hollow and dug through roots and soil until the truth surfaced, the memory remains. And for the ones who knew Daniel Rowe, the questions of those 2 lost days. How much could have been saved? And how quickly will always sit just beneath the surface, like something half buried, waiting for the earth to shift again. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories of disappearances, investigations, and the secrets hidden in the most unexpected places, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one.